So my remarks are going to be somewhat informal. But the topic that we're talking about is a topic that I've actually worked on quite a bit, not always so much specifically in relation to the problem of metaphysics itself, but certainly the issues around the nature of the transcendental and the role of the transcendental as a key idea, if you like, of, we might say, philosophical method. I actually think it's crucial to much of post-Kantian philosophy in different ways. And a lot of what I will be talking about a little bit later will be in relation to the idea of the transcendental and the role it plays or might play in relation to a particular conception of metaphysics and a particular conception of how we might respond to what I think of as the problem of metaphysics. As soon as one starts thinking about this, though, one of the first questions that arises is what metaphysics is and how we should understand metaphysics. If you go to Heidegger's Kant book, you'll find that Heidegger begins pretty much with a notion of metaphysics that he takes from the Wolfian tradition, metaphysics as essentially the inquiry into being, metaphysica generalis or ontologia generalis being the inquiry into being as such, and then various forms of metaphysica specialis, specific special ontologies associated with the being of the world, the cosmology, the being of human being, anthropology, the being of God, theology. And Heidegger begins with that account of metaphysics. But of course, there's a sense in which metaphysics isn't just identical with ontology understood as a particular branch of philosophy. There's a tendency, it seems to me, also to think of philosophy as itself almost identical with metaphysics, as if metaphysics and philosophy are pretty much encompass the same domain. And this seems to me to set up some interesting issues, one of which is the fact that within much of 20th century philosophy, but arguably much of post-Kantian philosophy, metaphysics has been in question, and it's been in question in the same way that philosophy itself has sometimes been in question. Within modern philosophy, that takes on a particular characteristic form, and this to some extent comes out of discussions Ingo and I have been having recently, in that one of the things that seems to characterize a great deal of modern philosophy, particularly in the continental tradition, but also in the analytic tradition, has been a suspicion of metaphysics, almost a critique or rejection of metaphysics. The problem is, on what basis can such a critique or rejection be grounded? It looks as if, in fact, any critique of metaphysics, if it's genuinely going to be a well-reasoned critique, if it's not simply going to be an arbitrary critique, has to presuppose some form of metaphysics, in the same way that the critique of philosophy would seem to presuppose a conception of philosophy. And I think you can see this within the history of engagement with metaphysics, particularly in the 20th century, but arguably even earlier than that. For instance, Kant's critique of metaphysics and the critical project, the transcendental project, is in part a critique of metaphysics. W.H. Walsh, for instance, in fact, has a book in which he talks about Kant's project in terms of the critique of metaphysics. And certainly much of Kant's critical project, particularly in the first critique and in the prolegomena, is concerned to, as it were, inquire into the limits of metaphysics at the very least. And yet, at the same time, Kant seems to hold to the idea that metaphysics still seems to be possible. After all, the prolegomena has the title prolegomena to any future metaphysics that will be able to come forth as a science. What then is metaphysics for Kant? Because that question is not one to which there seems to be a simple answer. One might argue that metaphysics becomes identical with the critical philosophy, but that doesn't really help us very much. And so even in Kant, it seems to me, this problem about the grounding of the critique of metaphysics, what it's grounded in, and the extent to which that grounding is itself a metaphysical grounding, seems to me to be there as a problem. It's not a problem, as it happens, that it seems to me Kant resolves, nor is it a problem that he's especially explicit about. In the late 19th and early 20th century, this recurs. It seems to me that the critique of idealist metaphysics that appears around the turn of the century, particularly in Russell, but also in the 1920s and 1930s in the work of empiricist thinkers, that critique of metaphysics itself presupposes a particular metaphysical position, essentially the position of empiricist philosophy, a position which very often turns into a form of scientism. It seems to me that that's true in Carnap, whose elimination of metaphysics turns out to depend on the replacement of what is essentially, in his view, idealist metaphysics with a form of empiricism that gives priority to some notion of empirical content. This is also true, it seems to me, in Quine, who can also be read as an anti-metaphysician in one sense, but who thinks that the question what there is still makes sense, except that the answer to the question what there is essentially going to be given by the empirical sciences. And so in Quine, what you have is the elimination of metaphysics in a sense, in the Carnapian sense, but it's still the retention of a form of metaphysics which turns out to be more or less identical with, if not physics, then with the idea of a unified science. So even when metaphysics is being rejected very often, there is still a commitment to a notion of metaphysics that remains. And that's true even in the two thinkers around whom a lot of my work has been focused, namely Donald Davidson and Martin Heidegger, both of whom hold anti-metaphysical positions in one sense, and yet both of whom also seem to be engaged in a form of metaphysics, in a metaphysical enterprise. We might say that it's an ontological enterprise and try and separate ontology from metaphysics, but they are still concerned with something like that. And in fact, for them, philosophy is fundamentally concerned with asking a certain sort of question that looks very much like some of the questions that have traditionally been seen as part of metaphysics. In Davidson, for instance, that becomes very clear in his essay on metaphysics, The Method of Truth in Metaphysics, in which he argues that, and you might read this essay as being quite Quinean in many respects, because what Davidson argues, or seems to argue on the surface, is almost something like a Carnapian or Quinean position, according to which metaphysics, the method of truth in metaphysics, is to be based on a form of logical analysis, or better, linguistic analysis. So the requirements of language, the basic structures that are evident when we do linguistic analysis, turn out to be also the basic structures of ontology, the basic structures of metaphysics. Now, as I say, on the face of that, that looks not too dissimilar from the sort of account you might find in Carnap or Quine, but as it happens, it turns out to be quite different, because Davidson rejects the notion of empirical content, and the ontological analysis that comes out of his linguistic analysis is not a logical analysis of the sort that mirrors what we find in Quine. What I want to suggest we get in Davidson, and in the sort of ontology, the ontological account that comes out of Davidson's work, is an account of, if you like, the logical presuppositions that are necessary for any possible language, rather than, as it were, a set of presuppositions that are independent of language. And this reflects, I think, Davidson's overall position, which is that ontology cannot be pursued other than in relation to reflection on questions of truth and questions of meaning, questions of interpretation. And so we have, if you like, what I think we could call a sort of interpretivist approach to metaphysics, in a very broad sense of metaphysics. And that actually delivers something that in some respects also has an anti-metaphysical tendency. And I'll say more about that in a moment. In Heidegger's case, there's also this critique of metaphysics, which very often takes the form, in my view, of what Heidegger calls in a critique of what Heidegger calls subjectivism, where subjectivism is the critique of, or the rejection of, any account which aims to understand being on the basis of some sort of hyperkamenon, some sort of underlying substrate. And part of Heidegger's critique of the tradition is that the tendency has always been, the metaphysical tendency has always been, to look for some particular metaphysical substrate as as the account of what being fundamentally is, and to see that substrate as that which underlies everything else. And of course, Heidegger is going to argue that this is true of subjectivism, it's true of idealism, it's true of the Cartesian position, but it's true also of materialism and physicalism, and all of those accounts which present themselves as forms of objectivism. And that's because subjectivism, as Heidegger's using it in this anti-metaphysical sense, is, as I indicated, this critique of the notion of a subject, that the notion of a hyperkamenon or something that underlies, which actually I think is a very common notion that continues to play an important role within modern philosophy, including modern analytic philosophy. Some of the contemporary critiques, for instance, of the notion of supervenience, that argue that supervenience is inadequate as a metaphysical position, are fundamentally reliant on the idea that metaphysics as an inquiry into what there is fundamentally an inquiry into the fundamental substrate on which every other discourse or vocabulary has to sit, supervene, you might say, except that supervenience leaves open the possibility of a form of non-reductive reliance. And a lot of analytic philosophers now, it seems to me, have effectively committed themselves to something much closer to a form of reductive supervenience, and that very much reflects this subjectivist position of the sort that Heidegger holds. Now, the thing about Heidegger, just like as with Davidson, is that Heidegger still holds to a certain sort of account of, as it were, what the real is in some sense, although that word real is an inappropriate term to use in relation to Heidegger, but what being is, that, as it were, turns out to be the ground on which the critique of standard metaphysics is possible. And it seems to me you can argue that what we have in Being and Time is an account to set out a metaphysics. It's certainly an attempt to set out an ontology that provides an account of the structure on the basis of which metaphysics in its problematic forms can arise. And you need that structure, partly if you're going to explain why metaphysics in its problematic forms is indeed problematic. You can't rule out forms of subjectivism unless you've got an account of why subjectivism is mistaken. And that means you do need to have some sort of account of the metaphysical or the ontological or the philosophical, which grounds your own critique. And that's what you get in both Davidson and in Heidegger. Now, one point I want to make here too is that it seems to me that one really broad way of characterizing metaphysics is that metaphysics is the attempt to try to uncover or to identify some sort of unique vocabulary or descriptive framework or account of what the absolute is, whether the absolute refers to world, or whether it refers to being, or whether it refers to the real, or whatever your preferred term is here. And so this is a sort of account that has resonances with Heidegger's notion of subjectivism. I think there's something right about that there is within metaphysics a tendency to want to find some sort of unique determinate account that underlies every other account. And I'm going to more or less take that. I'm happy to talk more about that idea later, but I'm going to take that as being what I think lies at the heart of metaphysics as a project, at the heart of metaphysics as a tendency within philosophy. It's the desire to find a unique vocabulary. Now, that brings with it a commitment to a notion of absolute truth, or at least of objective truth. That might be a little bit different from the notion of absolute truth. It depends on how we characterize those terms. I actually think that the notion of objective truth, while it plays a role within this conception of metaphysics, this notion of metaphysics as the attempt to provide a single, unique, determinate account, that notion of objective truth doesn't necessarily imply uniqueness in terms of the account we give. I think we're committed to a notion of objective truth, and I think that for Davidsonian reasons. I think the notion of objective truth is presupposed by the structure of discourse and the possibility of discourse, but I don't believe that notion implies uniqueness in terms of the metaphysical accounts we give, even though the uniqueness of metaphysical accounts does imply the notion of objective truth. And I'm, again, happy to say more about the notion of objective truth that I'm employing here again in discussion. I should add that this notion of objective truth does not imply the existence of eternal propositions. Like Davidson, I reject the idea of the proposition. I don't think there are such things. And so you can hold to a notion of objective truth that is nevertheless always a matter of the truth of propositions, and propositions are contingent entities, and so objective truth turns out to be contingent truth. And so there are some subtleties in how we understand that. So let me just say a little bit more about the Davidsonian and the Heideggerian accounts. As I say, I think both of them are committed to a certain sort of ontology as the basis for their own critiques of metaphysics. I'm not sure. Ingo might take the view that that becomes problematic in Heidegger. I'm not sure about that. In Davidson, unlike Heidegger, this is very much couched in terms of that interpretive or interpretationist approach that I alluded to earlier when I was talking about Davidson's paper on the method of truth in metaphysics. And you can see how it would follow from that account, particularly given Davidson's insistence on the indeterminacy of interpretation. Now, Davidson thinks that interpretation applies across the board. Any sort of account we give is both an interpretation and yet also subject to interpretation. So nothing stands outside the structure of interpretation. And interpretation for Davidson here does not mean the explicit or overt act of interpreting. It simply means the finding of meaning, the attributing of meaning. That's all that's at issue in the notion of interpretation. And Davidson claims that all interpretation is indeterminate. By that, Davidson means that if there's one true interpretation, then there will be many true interpretations. So the indeterminacy thesis directly rules out the idea of any uniqueness thesis in relation to meaningful utterances, in relation to sentences, in relation to attitudes, beliefs, or indeed in relation to theories or to scientific claims. Now, you can immediately see how the indeterminacy thesis alone will create problems for the uniqueness approach to metaphysics. Davidson will not hold to the view that a single unique account of the world or of the universe or of whatever we take to be the absolute, that any such unique determinate account is possible, because if there is one account, there will be many accounts. So the very possibility of a single account on Davidsonian grounds rules out any uniqueness. And that's partly why Davidson holds, for instance, to anomalous monism, according to which the vocabulary of physical description and of mental description apply equally to the objects and entities that make up the world. And neither of those forms of description is unique, and neither of them can, as it were, encompass the entire stage of description and rule out the other. Now, Davidson, in fact, although he doesn't make much of this in his published writing, was very, very clear that he did not believe that the mental and physical vocabularies were the only two vocabularies here. His view is that there is an infinite number of possible vocabularies by means of which the world can be described. And so if we wanted to say that Davidson was held to a metaphysics, then there would be two senses of metaphysics at work in Davidson. There would be the metaphysics that comes out of his interpreter's position, which is really the metaphysics that specifies the sort of basic logical structure that is presupposed by the possibility of language or of meaning. And that's the structure that he essentially gets out of in the early work, a Taskian truth theory, which later on is given in terms of the structure of triangulation and so on. It's a structure in which both subjectivity and objectivity, but also intersubjectivity, play a part. And it's a structure in which, as it were, ontology becomes a mirror of epistemology to some extent. And Davidson says famously that the methodology of interpretation is nothing but epistemology seen in the mirror of meaning. And for Davidson, I think that can apply to the notion of to what ontology is as well to some extent, or metaphysics. The other concept of metaphysics, we might say, applies to Davidson, is going to be the concept of metaphysics as it relates to these all-encompassing descriptions of the world. And Davidson's going to say simply, there's an infinite number of those possible descriptions. That means that he is not committed to physicalism in the sense of it being the case that physical theory is the only description we can give of the world, or the fundamental description. He will be committed to the idea that if physical theory is correct, then there are necessarily lots of other accounts of the world that we can give, which are not reducible to physical theory, and yet which are equally applicable. In saying that, he doesn't rule out the possibility that there will be some accounts that are incorrect, that are not true, but he will hold to, if you like, a multiple metaphysics. On the one hand, he's got a unified metaphysics, which is his monism, which is just the commitment to the, as it were, consistency in some sense of all accounts at a general level. And yet, on the other hand, he's got a multiple or a pluralistic metaphysics, which is essentially a commitment to the plurality of possible true descriptions. Now, I think, so essentially, Davidson is going to rule out, he's going to reject that more traditional conception of metaphysics, according to which metaphysics is going to give us a single, true, unique, determinate description. And this is just a reflection, again, of his position in the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of language, where similarly indeterminacy is related to a similar form of pluralism. Now, I actually think although Heidegger doesn't appeal to considerations in the philosophy of language, I actually think that there's an implicit commitment to a similar indeterminacy thesis in Heidegger, and necessarily so. So I will argue that Heidegger, while he's not necessarily going to give us the same sort of account, the same sort of ontological account that's derived from the structure of language that we get in Davidson, I do think he's going to give us an account of, let's say, the structure of Dasein that mirrors aspects of Davidson's account, mirrors certain structural features of that account, and so can be seen as giving us a form of ontology or metaphysics, and yet it's also going to provide the basis for the rejection of metaphysics in the traditional sense that I talked about earlier. This idea of metaphysics is about a unique conception. Now, having said all that, I want to say a little bit about the methodological structure that's at work here. And it's a methodological structure that I think goes back to Kant, and it's the point at which the conception of the transcendental enters into this. Now, it has to be said that when we talk about the transcendental in relation to Heidegger, this is a problematic notion, because Heidegger does, in the end, give the notion of the transcendental a very specific sense that's associated with the notion of transcendence. And in that sense, both transcendence and the transcendental are largely disavowed by Heidegger by the mid-1930s. So by the time of the Beiträge, notions of transcendence and the transcendental disappear. In very late Heidegger, you can find an explicit critique of the transcendental in the Feldweggespräch. So this is a slightly problematic term to use across the entirety of Heidegger's work, but I think it still has some applicability, and I'll explain why in a moment. The transcendental is a term that's used by Davidson on several occasions. He doesn't explain it very much, and yet he acknowledges that his position involves a certain form of transcendental argument. And although there are few occasions on which he does this in his published work, certainly in conversation and discussion, Don was quite clear that he felt that there was this transcendental element, that it was fundamental, and it was something also that frequently came up in discussion between Davidson and Dieter Henrich, for instance, who also had an interest in this issue. So how does the transcendental appear here? Why does it have to appear? Because I want to argue that the critique of metaphysics, but even as it occurs in Heidegger and Davidson, requires some sort of transcendental term. And the reason it comes up is because not only does the critique of metaphysics need to ground itself, and it can only ground itself in metaphysics, it cannot ground itself in anything that is transcendent of what's already given, at least not in the sense of going beyond, let's say, what is immanent. And so there is a commitment, it seems to me, in Davidson and Heidegger, and to some extent in Kant, although in Kant this is also problematic, that the metaphysics that is the ground for the critique of metaphysics has to, in some sense, be an immanent metaphysics. Okay? Now, this, I think, is the problem that the transcendental is trying to address. And I think there are hints of this, very clear hints of this in Kant, particularly in the methodological reflections in the first critique, where Kant, for instance, talks about at one point using a geographical metaphor and argues that, for instance, if we want to understand the total circumference of a sphere, but we only have access to part of that sphere, then we can deduce the circumference of the sphere on the basis simply of the curvature of a part of the sphere, assuming that the sphere is regular. Now, something like that notion seems to apply to Kant's transcendental argument in general and to the critical philosophy in general, and that what Kant seems to be wanting to do is to provide an account of the whole, of the unity of the world, or of the unity of knowledge, on the basis of a part of knowledge, given one presupposition, which is that knowledge is in some sense integral or regular. And now I read this in terms of my own work, in terms of the topographical or topological approach I use, as being an account that depends on understanding the way in which we are already embedded in a place, and we are able to, as it were, come to an account of the structure of that place, of the larger landscape in which we find ourselves, by, as it were, extrapolating through triangulation and traverse, to use traditional topographical terms, to the structure of the landscape as a whole. And Kant sometimes uses these sorts of metaphors. Jump ahead to Davidson and Heidegger, and Dennis is looking at me very strangely there. So I'm thinking, I've made the mistake of having Dennis as the one who's mostly appearing on my screen, so I'm seeing every reaction.
No, it's all right.
If we jump ahead to Davidson and Heidegger, I think this sort of transcendental move is operative there too. This move that begins from our embeddedness in the world, in the case of Davidson and Heidegger, and looks to use that embeddedness as the basis for the ontological account they give, which is then going to be the basis for the critique of metaphysics. And this peculiar structure has actually been discussed at quite some length in the literature on transcendental argument. Often that literature is focused on the transcendental arguments in Kant, but there's been some discussion of the form of reasoning, as it were, that's at work here more generally. And this has often been seen as a problem because it's identified as a form of circularity. The sort of locus classicus for the critique or the claim that this is circular is, of course, in Barry Stroud's work. And to put it very simply, Stroud's argument is that what transcendental reasoning aims to do is to legitimate, to validate certain claims to knowledge. So in the case of Davidson and Heidegger, it's the account of being in the world, if you like, that each of them give in their own terms, to validate that account on the basis of some claim as to its necessity, given the fact that we are already in the world. And Stroud's going to say, yeah, well, you might be forced to assume that that account is true, but all you need to do is assume that it's true. So all it needs to be is a conditional assumption, and that could still be compatible with it being false. And so Stroud famously claims that transcendental reasoning always presupposes a verificationist premise. Now, I think actually the problem, and this argument comes up again and again, there is a long literature dealing with the supposed problem of circularity within transcendental reasoning. Some of that literature goes back to Kant or to discussions of Kant. It reappears in Rorty's work, for instance. It appears in Rudiger Bubner's work. It appears in Malka S. Graham's work. I actually think that the problem with that critique is that it's already presupposes, as it were, the truth, or it presupposes exactly what's at issue here. So it begs the question in a problematic way. And that is, it assumes this distinction between language, between our reasoning and the world. And the whole force of Davidson and Heidegger's arguments is that that distinction is problematic. And it seems to me that that becomes very clear, particularly in Davidson, in his rejection of the subjective-objective distinction, what he calls the myth of the subjective, as an ontologically fundamental distinction. And it seems to me also we find that in Heidegger too. That's not a rejection of the distinction as such. It's rather a rejection of that distinction as one that can be understood to be operative at the base level. And if you reject that distinction at that level, then you also reject the assumption or the presupposition on which arguments like Stroud's depend, so that the circularity of transcendental argument is not a vicious circularity. This is a point that Heidegger makes. It is rather just the circularity that's given in the structure of being in the world as such. Being in the world is the condition for the possibility of meaningfulness, and meaningfulness and being in the world are so much bound up together that they are not given separately. And because they're not given separately, they cannot, as it were, be set against one another in any respect. So, as I said, part of what I think is going on in Davidson and Heidegger and in this anti-metaphysical tradition that I think their work is representative of is what I've come to understand as a sort of hermeneutical response to the problem of metaphysics, a hermeneutical topology, if you like, because I want to argue that the circularity that we find here in the transcendental is a hermeneutic circularity, which is also the circularity of our being in place, and that this circularity is the real basis for a critique of metaphysics, because it forces us to accept that there can be no single account of the world, the universe, or of being that can be given priority as unique. And it also forces us to accept that we cannot get away from a commitment to the interpretations of the world that we provide for ourselves, and that those interpretations are only to be measured against the same interpretive engagement in which we're already embedded. So as it were, we're already involved in metaphysics because we're involved in the world, but that's not a problematic involvement so long as we do not give in to the idea that we can, as it were, give priority to any single account. And so the idea of metaphysics as the provision of a single account, a single uniquely true account of the universe or of the world or of being, that form of metaphysics is rejected, and yet a form of metaphysics is still retained, what I would argue is a legitimate and well-grounded sense of metaphysics, as simply the attempt, the constantly renewed attempt, because there is never a completion here, the constantly renewed attempt to interpret, to understand, to articulate our own being in the world. And that's constant and ongoing. And it's in the constancy of that project that the real objectivity of that account is to be found. So I hope that's not too summary and too broad and general in character, and that it provides us with something to talk about over the next hour or two. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. So yeah, we've got about 20 minutes for Q&A session. Yes, and please feel free to ask questions. Yeah, I think that Maxim has got a question, so please step forward.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you very much for your talk. I have a question that perhaps not necessarily related to your point, but I wonder whether you can say something illuminating on this topic. As far as I understand the Davidsonian development, the development of Davidson's thought in time, I can see a tendency that starts from an idea that we have to, in philosophy as in other sciences, have a theory in a strong sense of the word, a theory that's a view that perhaps was inspired by his collaboration in this decision-making lab and so on. And from this point of having a theory of truth in a for a given language, in a strong sense of the word, of a theory of truth for a given language, as for example in his John Locke lectures, The Structure of Truth, and other papers. And in late Davidson, it seems to me, has given up the idea of having a theory in any strong sense of the world. And I wonder whether whether your reconstruction of his anti-metaphysical stance is his anti-metaphysical program is connected in some way with his thoughts about having a theory in philosophy. Because I recall in one of his autobiographical papers, where he said that, well, the experience of having a true theory was very important for him. The experience of working within a true theory, within a true theoretical framework. And it seems to me that he has given up this idea in the late papers. So perhaps you can perhaps you can connect it with his metaphysical or anti-metaphysical enterprises.
So the critique of theory usually is it's primarily located in the late papers, the anti-conventionalist papers, a nice arrangement of epitaphs in Communication and Convention, and also in the social. I always forget the exact title, The Social Nature of Language. I've forgotten the exact title, but I think you probably know the paper. It's essentially the paper in which he responds to Michael Dummett and to Dummett's own arguments against a nice arrangement of epitaphs. Now, in all of those papers, Davidson's first target is a certain conception of how we understand language. And his basic claim, the famous notorious claim that he makes in a nice arrangement of epitaphs, is that there is no such thing as a language. And then he adds, not if by language we mean what philosophers and theorists of language usually mean, which is a prior determinate theory. Okay. And this notion of a prior theory is supposed to be a theory that exists prior to the linguistic encounter, and through the almost mechanical application of which we generate meanings which we can attribute to sentences or to utterances. And Davidson claims that this is at best an idealization of what is operative in real linguistic understanding, and that no theory, no prior theory at any rate, can genuinely be adequate to the complexities of the linguistic encounter. Now, significantly, in a nice arrangement of epitaphs, he doesn't say no theory at all, unqualified. He distinguishes between two forms of theory, what he calls a prior theory and a passing theory. And he says that what happens in a linguistic encounter is that speaker and interpreter have to converge on their passing theories. So he's still willing to say you can have a theory that applies to a linguistic encounter, that is a task-in-style truth theory. It's just that its application is going to be extremely limited, and it cannot be used simply to generate attributions of meaning in the usual way in which it's assumed that theories will. So the convergence on a theory is actually the outcome of the interpretive encounter rather than that which enables the interpretive encounter. And I think that idea, which in those papers, Communication and Intention, the social aspect of language, and in a nice range of epitaphs, although that's primarily directed at a specific approach within semantic theory, within the philosophy of language, you can generalize that account more broadly, so that to some extent this applies to how we might theorize about the world, that our theories are simply always incomplete and have to be so. So that means that if we take that seriously, then not only is language always incomplete, it's a constant project in which we're involved, but so is our engagement with the world. Now, the thing is, in order to be able to show that, Davidson's still got to be able to give an account of what's going on there. And so he's still committed, as it were, to there being a theory, okay, that has overarching application. What's he going to say in response to that? He'll say, yeah, of course there's a theory. It's just that the theory I give you is going to be itself subject to the same interpretive indeterminacy. So you can give another account of how these structures operate, and they might differ in terms of detail, but they will be the same in terms of the broad structure that they give you, right? Now, Davidson's not going to say that that means the two theories, all of these theories are the same. He's not going to say that a set of theories that are indeterminate with respect to one another are the same. He comes close to saying that sometimes, but he's not going to say that because he can't give a unique account of what sameness is either. And he makes this point in respect of lots of mundane cases of indeterminacy as well, indeterminacy of measurement, for instance. So now I don't think this is a strong point of difference between early and late Heidegger, but between early and late Davidson. I think it's already implicit in early Davidson because of the way in which the indeterminacy thesis is already present in early Davidson. And you're exactly right about the role of his work in decision theory here, because that early work that Davidson does with Pat Supes at Stanford, that early work is the place where Davidson really seems to have got the idea of indeterminacy out of, because part of what they were doing there was looking at the interrelation between notions of subjective probability and belief belief and desire, essentially, as that was given. The surrogates for that in the early work were assignments of subjective probability and gambling behavior. So Davidson's already in that work, which he himself said was very limited. He gave that up for various reasons. You can already find the indeterminacy thesis at work there. And a lot of Davidson's subsequent work, both his use of Ramsey, his use of Tarski, and his use of Quine, all represent a working out of an indeterminacy thesis that's fundamentally based in the holistic interrelationship of elements, whether beliefs and desires, beliefs and meanings, whatever. Okay, and so we get this interesting development that becomes more pronounced in Davidson's work as he comes more and more to recognize just how strong this holistic structure is. Also, the way in which it implies a form of externalism, which is something I haven't really talked about, and the way in which it's tied up with indeterminacy. And so all of this develops until we get, in the very late Davidson, this emphasis, which is on the one hand monistic, but on the other hand also pluralistic. And yet the lectures on the structure and content of truth, which are themselves quite late, okay, which begin as the Dewey lectures, those lectures remain committed to the idea that we can give an account of the structure of truth, the structure and content of truth. It's just that that structure is not given in terms of the specification of a single account of truth. It's not given, for instance, in terms of a correspondence theory. It's given through an account of the pattern that truth makes and of the pattern that we find in the interrelation of truth with the propositional and other attitudes. And so it's a very different sort of approach. Now, you know, I'm happy to go out on a limb and draw comparisons between that approach and some of Heidegger's work in different ways, but I know I'm going out on a limb in doing so, and it requires some particular readings of both Davidson and Heidegger, and that's what I did in my very early work when I was writing on both Davidson and Heidegger in close proximity to one another. It's not something I've done so much work on recently, but I do think that there are these important structural similarities in terms of what both are doing. So I hope that answers or addresses your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. So, any more questions? Birmin, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I couldn't agree more with the whole setting, especially when in your comparison between Davidson and Heidegger. But when we compare them, we might also look at the differences. And a word which doesn't appear in your talk is this practical and pragmatical presuppositions, which are much more in the foreground of the Heideggerian approach, whereas when Davidson talks about the same topic, he has more or less these mathematical models in his background. So there is a big difference in the way the form of reflection is going on in Heidegger's style and in Heidegger's way of putting things in comparison to Davidson. And this has to do with the last question, the question of what form of theory do we propose when we reflect on the presuppositions of understanding, meaning, reference, and all these stuff. And I think that in the Heideggerian approach, the practical presuppositions, that means the can-dos, are much more in the foreground. And in the Davidsonian approach, there is much more in the foreground the approach which comes from the modern philosophy of language, which uses models for talking about meaning or talking about reference and talking about a language. What would you say to these comparisons or differences? Because even in the pragmatic approach from Brandom and other pragmatics, they still come from this more or less mathematical approach and not so much commenting on the practical approach. So, okay, Jeff.
Well, thank you very much, Pim, because that's a really good question. And I'm going to complicate the picture a bit more, because I think that on the one hand, we underappreciate the pragmatic elements in Davidson, and on the other, I think we overemphasize sometimes the pragmatic elements in Heidegger. So, and for me, this became quite important because when I was in my very early work, I used to spend a lot of time in Berkeley, where I would see both Don Davidson and Bert Dreyfus. And of course, Bert Dreyfus was very much a proponent of his own brand of the practical approach and had a reading of Heidegger that went with that. And he tended, while on the one hand he wanted engagement with Davidson, he also wanted to show that Davidson's objectivist approach, as he saw it, and he assimilated a certain form of objectivism to, if you like, the formalism of Davidson's work. He wanted to show that that was mistaken. And, you know, on the face of it, Davidson's work begins with work in formal semantic theory. So it begins with Tarski, right, which is, and admittedly, Davidson says that you cannot apply Tarski to natural languages in the same way that Tarski intended it to apply to formal languages. And Tarski famously restricted his definition of truth to formal languages. But still, Davidson is certainly using models that look much more formal, much more based in logic, in mathematical logic, than is anything we find in Heidegger. So what to say about that? Well, firstly, I think if we think about Davidson to begin with, one of the things that I think is missed in Davidson, and this is certainly true of Dreyfus's reading, is that Davidson is very often treated as much more committed to, if you like, a more mathematical or formalistic position than is warranted. It's interesting to reflect on the relation between Davidson and someone like Brandom. Brandom, I remember talking to Bob Brandom about this and the connections between his work and Davidson, and Brandom said, I'm a Davidsonian. My work is fundamentally committed to and indebted to Davidson's work. Now, that's an interesting thing for Brandom to say, okay? And I think it reflects something that actually used to bother Davidson, which is the idea that Davidson can simply be situated within pragmatism, which often happens. He's often treated as a pragmatist. Davidson rejected that. okay? And there were a number of reasons why he did. And yet there is this strongly pragmatic element in Davidson, partly because of the influence of G.H. Mead, who is an incredibly important figure for Davidson. It's from Mead that Davidson takes the idea of triangulation. We mustn't forget that he's also indebted to Quine, who also is a pragmatist, but also a scientist. And it's the scientism that in a large part Davidson rejects, and the behaviorism of Quine is something Davidson also rejects. But when you look at the development of Davidson's work, you can start to see how, if you like, I don't want to call it a pragmatic element, but an emphasis on what I'm calling our concrete being in the world is constantly being presupposed and constantly coming to the fore. I think this is particularly important when we try and understand how triangulation works, because triangulation, although it looks like a sort of formal structure, Davidson intends it to be understood in terms of our concrete relationship in the world as we are connected to an interlocutor and connected to objects. And we're, rather as in Gadamer, involved in a three-way conversation between these. And so that becomes more and more important in Davidson's work, but some of that is hard to bring out. I remember once in a seminar where one of Bert Dreyfus's students, it was a seminar on philosophy of action, said to Davidson, but, this account has got to be wrong, because action can't have anything to do with belief in the way that you think it does. And Don's response was, okay, why not? Tell me, what do you think a belief is? Oh, said the student, it's a certain propositional attitude in the brain, isn't it? Why would you think that, said Davidson? Why isn't a habit a belief? Why isn't a propensity to behave in a certain way a belief? And I think that's indicative of the way in which a lot of the terms Davidson uses, like belief, we often interpret in narrower ways than Davidson intends them. And I think constantly what's at work in Davidson is an attempt to rethink fundamental terms like belief and to rethink them in new ways. So for Davidson, belief, the attitudes generally, are not to be understood in terms of their pure propositional content, rather that they are to be understood in terms of patterns of being in the world. I mean, we can say patterns of behavior, but Davidson would say that's not quite enough. So I think there's a lot of evidence in Davidson that, in fact, his account, although it draws on mathematical and scientific and formal models, is not restricted to those models. And that's part of what becomes very evident in a late paper like on the very idea of a nice arrangement of epitaphs, and also a paper like on the very idea of a conceptual scheme, which is partly directed against certain formalist approaches. Now, in Heidegger's case, I think there's a very common reading of Heidegger that argues that fundamentally for Heidegger, and this is the extreme of this is in Dreyfus, who essentially wants to argue that all of Heidegger is to be construed in the terms that Dreyfus uses, which is in terms of everyday coping. So for Dreyfus's reading of Heidegger, there is problematically no real role for reflection in Heidegger as Dreyfus sees it, because everything is just a matter of our being out there in the world. Bert's favourite example was him driving down to the Berkeley campus from his home up in the hills. And he would drive down and say, when I get down there, I don't know what I did to get there because it's all automatic. It's all bodily memory. It's all praxis. Now, I don't think that works as an account of Heidegger any more than it works as an account of Davidson either. And so I think we have to allow that in Heidegger too, we cannot reduce the Heideggerian account just to a matter of practical involvement. And in both cases, we need a different concept. We need this something like a notion of our concrete being in the world, that they are both trying to get at in different ways. And Heidegger does it in a different way in Being and Time to the way he does it, let's say, in Building Dwelling Thinking or in any of the late work. But what comes first is this being in the world that is not reducible to unreflective coping, but is also not reducible to reflective engagement either. These are both aspects of the way in which we are in a unified fashion in the world, and that encompasses both of these. And I think there's ample evidence that that's at work in both of them. So acknowledging that in terms of their philosophical comportment, their way of thinking, Davidson is more likely to go to formalist models and semantic theory than Heidegger is. Okay, but I think that can easily overshadow, it can easily lead us to neglect the way in which there is this much more fundamental level of convergence. So yes, of course, there are differences between them. They write in different languages. You know, there was no way that Davidson was going to be able to engage with Heidegger's text or Gadamer's text, for that matter, at a really basic level, and vice versa. Davidson once asked me what he should read of Heidegger's if he was going to come to grips with Heidegger, and I said, there's no point. There is no single text you can read. And this was when Davidson was in his late 70s, 80s. There was no way Davidson was going to be able to make sense of Heidegger. And that's reflected in the difficulties he has in making sense of Gadamer in the Library of Living Philosophers volume. So there are enormous divides in terms of approach and method and philosophical tendency. But I think we mustn't allow that to overshadow the fact that at the core of their thinking, there is a similar attempt to get through some of the philosophical language that we've become used to rethink that language and to rethink it in a way that's grounded in our active being in the world. So I hope that goes some way to addressing.
Yes, thank you very much, Jeff. Only two remarks. The first, I was, of course, also in Berkeley. I studied there as a graduate student with Dreyfus and all these guys. And the second point is I just realized, I didn't know that before, that Heidegger was very well educated in mathematics. He had even a better education in mathematics than you find in Carnap or Davidson. And therefore, the interesting point is that later he decided against the formal and consciously and to write in a different style. And it's not just by accident. And that's the only point I want to make. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I agree with you. But the funny thing about Davidson is, see, Davidson's early training is in classics and literature.
Exactly.
The opposite to Heidegger,
the opposite,
right?
Exactly.
And then he goes to Harvard, and he has Werner Jaeger as his supervisor for a thesis on the Philebus, and then he gets to know Quine, and Quine convinces him that analytic philosophy is the way to go. And so he has this, he gets engaged with semantic theory, he does this work on decision theory, and he comes into that. But he always retained the early work he did, which incidentally was with Whitehead. He was one of Whitehead's favourite students, and that, I think, has an enormous influence on Davidson. And it's reflected in funny ways. It's reflected in the constant use of literary examples in his work. They're everywhere. The first time we were in Berkeley a few days, and Davidson invited us to his house for dinner, and he invited Bert at the same time. Bert was surprised because he said, I've never had dinner with the Davidsons before. And we had dinner, and I turn up and Bert turns up. And Bert and I had been having an argument about Greek mythology, about the ancestry of Odysseus. And Don says, what are you arguing about? And we tell him, and Don says, oh, well, that's clear. Jeff is right. I can tell you, and here are the sources, and he cites the relevant passages in the Greek sources. And Bert's dumbfounded. He said, how come you know so much about Greek classical? I said, Davidson, I spent a whole year reading Greek, right? And so, you know, he was a lover of James Joyce. So, you know, I think of course, there are these differences, and yet they increasingly come together. And I think, you know, a lot of Davidson's late writing, he writes on Joyce. He has a wonderful piece on Joyce. He has works on metaphor and so on. So, yeah, there is this Tarskian stuff in there, and there is the Quine. But that is not what is at the core of his thinking. At the core of his thinking is something else, right? And so, you know, if you look closely at their work, I think you can find the ways in which in both cases, there's an attentiveness to language that is really important for both of them, and which is there despite everything else that they do.